Hello everyone and welcome to History's Dark Chronicles. I'm Alan G. and I will be your host. If you like what you see, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of any future episodes. Between 1968 and 1985, a serial killer dubbed the Monster of Florence murdered 16 people across the Italian region of Tuscany. While those crimes have never been solved, the relatives of several victims are now demanding a new investigation and claim key evidence was overlooked. The Monster of Florence insidiously targeted couples who were engaged in sexual activity in remote areas. The killer used a Beretta pistol to murder 8 couples and was never caught. While a few suspects emerged and some were convicted over the years, an accurate accounting of all the murders has never been perfected.
The first known victims of the monster were Antonio Lobianco and his Sardinian lover, Barbara Locci. They were killed on the night of August 21, 1968, in Signa, a small town near Florence, while having sex in a car. Locci's 6-year-old son, Natalino, was asleep in the car and woke up because of the loud gunshots. The killer then carried him over his shoulders while singing a popular song to ease him. He took the boy to a stranger's house and left him there alive. Upon being found, Natalino told the house's occupant that his father was sick at home and that his mother and uncle were dead in a car. Natalino was later able to give a physical description of the killer, though his story didn't definitely point to any suspects. In later interrogations, Natalino would later recant his previous version of the story and claim that he walked to the house alone, which was immediately negated by the fact that he had no shoes on when he was found and didn't appear to have walked over to the house shoeless, or that there was more than one person present and that one had called the killer Salvatore. Locci's husband, Stefano Mele, was arrested following the murders. During interrogations, he confirmed his son's first version of the story that he had been homesick during the murders. When a paraffin glove test showed that he had recently fired a gun, he admitted that he had been present at the crime scene. He also claimed that another one of his wife's lovers, Salvatore Vinci, had been the gunman. Soon afterwards, Mele withdrew the accusations and claimed full responsibility of the double homicide. He said that he had thrown the murder weapon in a ditch, but it was never found. Mele was found guilty of the murder and sentenced to only 14 years in prison on the grounds of so-called infirmity of mind, though he later recanted his confession. A theory that was made later suggested that he had been an accomplice in the murders and that he had only fired a shot into Locci post-mortem, explaining the positive results attained from the paraffin glove test. 6 years later, another couple, Pasquale Gentilacore and Stefania Pettini, was found brutally murdered. Pettini was also taken out of the car post-mortem, stabbed superficially over 90 times, and violated with a grapevine's branch. Another 7 years went by, and a third double homicide occurred in June 1981. The victims were identified as Giovanni Foggi and Carmelo Denuzio. The latter's genitals were cut post-mortem and taken by the killer. All 3 double homicides were believed to be unrelated until Mario Spezzi, a crime journalist working at La Nazione, recognized the similarities between the 1974 and 1981 murders and proclaimed them to be the work of a serial killer whom he dubbed the Monster of Florence. A local voyeur, Enzo Spalletti, was arrested because he had talked about the murders with his wife before they were publicized. As a result of his suspicion, he spent 3 months in preventative prison, but was then released when the monster struck again in October. The victims were Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi. Two couples came forward and stated that they had seen a lone and slightly crazy-looking man driving away from the scene in a red-colored Alfa Romeo. These testimonies led to the elaboration of the first and most popular sketch of the killer. The next victims, Paolo Minardi and Antonello Migliorini, were killed on June 19, 1982. Because Migliorini had seen coverage about the monster and was afraid of getting murdered by the killer, the couple decided to sacrifice some privacy in favor of more safety and thus parked in a slightly busy area that was visible from the street, rather than deep in the woods as originally planned. As a result, Minardi could see the monster approaching as he and Migliorini remained in the vehicle. The monster immediately shot the both of them, killing Migliorini. Gravely wounded, Minardi started the engine and started driving in reverse, eventually leaving the car trapped in a ditch across the street. The car was soon found by a passing motorist, who initially mistook it for an accident and stopped to help. Interrupted by this, the monster abandoned the scene without managing to perform his signature mutilation on Migliorini, or even finishing off Minardi, who was still barely alive. Minardi died a few hours later in the hospital. Though Minardi never regained consciousness, the assistant prosecutor worked on the case, Silvia Della Monica, issued a press release in which she claimed that Minardi had survived long enough to say some words in an attempt to get the killer to expose himself. On the afternoon following the statement's publication, a Red Cross emergency worker who had accompanied Minardi to the hospital was called by a man who claimed to be the killer and asked what Minardi had said. The same emergency worker was later called again by the same person while on vacation in Rimini. This second call left the investigators baffled as to how the caller knew how to reach the man. On July 1st, 12 days after the Migliorini-Minardi murder, the police headquarters received a letter containing a yellowed 1968 newspaper clipping of the Loki Lobianco shooting. Over the article, someone had scrawled, "Take another look at this crime." The police compared the shells of the 1968 murder with those found at the recent killings and found the following. The bullets found at all the crime scenes had all been fired by the same gun. The bullets came from the same box. The monster's gun had a defective firing pin that left behind distinctive, unique markings on each casing. The ammo was copper-jacketed Winchester rounds of Series H. Though Mele could not be responsible for the 1981 crime, as he was still in prison, he was found by Spizzi in a halfway house located in Verona and interviewed him. All the while, Mele believed the interview was meant for a documentary about the place. Mele mumbled several confusing remarks before finishing with, "They need to figure out where that pistol is. Otherwise, there will be more murders. They will continue to kill. They will continue." Mele's words were taken as evidence that the 1968 murder had been a traditional Sardinian clan killing, planned beforehand and performed by a group of men usually related to each other, rather than an impromptu crime of passion by Mele alone. In clan killings, the gun was either destroyed afterward or preserved in a safe location, but never abandoned at the crime scene like Mele had claimed. The police theorized that another man present at the scene had kept the gun and liked the experience enough to recreate it years later. This theory was dubbed the Pista Sarda, or the Sardinian Connection. The officers investigated the brothers of Mele and Salvatore Vinci, the man Mele had originally accused in 1968, all members of Florence's Sardinian community. When they discovered a car in the woods that belonged to Salvatore's younger brother, Francesco, the police believed the car was used in a crime and that Francesco had hid it in an attempt to evade suspicion. Francesco was arrested in late 1983. Soon after, the monster killed two German tourists, Horst William Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch. This time, both victims were male and neither was mutilated. It is believed that the monster mistook Rusch, who had long blonde hair, for a woman. A torn-up gay pornographic magazine was found at the scene, leading some to suspect that the victims were a homosexual couple and that the monster tore up the magazine in anger when he realized his mistake. Because the monster was able to shoot Meyer and Rusch through the windows of their van, a considerably higher vehicle than the usual Italian vehicle, It was believed that the killer was a man of at least 5 feet 9 in height. The police still weren't sure that Vinci wasn't the monster, however. As a result, they took the mistake of targeting 2 men rather than a man and a woman as evidence that one of Vinci's relatives had tried to copycat a crime in an attempt to get him released. Francesco's nephew, Antonio, was arrested on a weapons charge, followed by Francesco's brother and Antonio's father, Salvatore, for the suspicious 1961 death of his wife in Sardinia. All 3 were interrogated for months, hoping that at least one of them would eventually break down and confess to being the monster. But they consistently denied everything and were eventually released. On July 29, 1984, the monster killed again, the victims being Claudio Stefanici and Pia Gilda Rotini. This time, all of the traits of a typical monster murder were present, plus a new one. Rotini's left breast was taken along with her genitalia. The monster used gloves again, but he mistakenly left behind a handprint on the top of the car and knee marks on the side, which confirmed the police's suspicions that he was right-handed and over 5 feet 9 inches tall. This new crime led to the formation of a special strike force dubbed Squadra Entremostro, formed by both policemen and carabinieri. This was the direct precedent of Italy's modern investigative group of serial crimes, GIDES. The government also offered a reward of $290,000 for any information leading to the capture of the monster, and distributed posters and postcards advising tourists to not go into the hills around Florence at night. Despite these efforts, the monster killed one last time in September 1985. The victims were a couple of French tourists named Jean-Michel Kravishvili and Nadine Morillo. Their bodies were found at 2 p.m. on September 9th by a mushroom picker. The investigators estimated the time of death to have been the previous day, though a call girl, Sabrina Carmignani, came forward and recounted how she and a friend spotted the greatly decomposed bodies that day. Her testimony was ignored completely, even though Kravishvili and Morillo were most likely driving back to France on September 8th for her to be present when her daughter went on her first day of school on September 9th. The evidence suggested that the monster punctured their tent with a knife and waited outside for the victims to investigate, shooting them afterward. Morillo was hit in the face and died instantly, but Kravishvili, an amateur champion of the 100-meter dash, was only injured in the wrist and ran into the woods. The monster ran after Kravishvili, caught up with him, and killed him with a single slash that sliced Kravishvili's throat to the point of near decapitation. The killer then returned to Morillo's body and took her left breast and genitalia. On September 10th, Silvia Della Monica received a letter, the address of which was made of letters cut out of magazines and read Dot Della Monica Silvia Procura della Repubblica, 5,000 Forense. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was Morillo's nipple. The letter was estimated to have been mailed sometime during the weekend and to have entered the postal system on September 9th. There had been no fingerprints, and the sender had avoided sealing the letter with his tongue despite DNA technology being non-existent at the time. The experience traumatized Della Monica, who dropped out of the case and retired from law enforcement soon after. After this, the monster was never heard from again. The examining magistrate, Mario Rotella, remained convinced that a Sardinian clan member was responsible. He was particularly suspicious of Salvatore Vinci, even though Vinci was still in custody when the French couple was murdered. Without evidence of Vinci's involvement in the monster murders, Rotella indicted him for the murder of his wife instead. However, Vinci's son refused to testify against his father, and the other witnesses' testimonies were extremely vague. Vinci was acquitted, and he left the country. This angered Chief Prosecutor Pier Luigi Vigna, who was a proponent of the theory that the monster was not involved in the Loki Lobianco shooting, for which nobody could be prosecuted since Melee had already been convicted of it, and only acquired the gun from the Sardinians. Vigna and the police demanded to restart the investigation, but Rotella and the Carabinieri refused. When Vigna prevailed, Rotella and the Carabinieri disbanded the task force at once. Henceforth, the Squadra Anti-Mostro would be a pure police operation led by Commissario Ruggero Perugni, who shared Vigna's opinion and also considered that all physical evidence gathered at the murder scenes was unreliable due to poor preservation by authorities. All Sardinian suspects were officially cleared in 1989. The case subsequently became the largest in Italy's criminal history, with over 100,000 people interrogated in connection with the crimes. On September 11, 1985, the task force received an anonymous letter reporting Pietro Pacciani, a semi-literate Tuscan farmer in his 60s with a violent past. In 1951, Pacciani attacked his future wife and a rival lover while they were kissing in a car. He took the man out, bashed his head with a rock, and fatally stabbed him 19 times. Afterward, he forced the woman to lie next to the corpse and he raped her, then stole the man's wallet and raped his corpse. It was argued that his crime bore resemblance to the monster's M.O., though any profiler could argue that his attack was a textbook disorganized crime while the monster's murders were organized. In addition, the monster never stole items from his victims, even though he opened and played with the women's purses on 3 occasions. Nevertheless, Perugini found it interesting that Pacciani had been prompted to act when his girlfriend revealed one of her breasts to the lover, which Perugini compared to the monster's mutilation of the left breast in the last 2 shootings. Perugini ran a computer search of local residents with antecedents for sex crimes, propensity for violence, and prison sentences that could explain the gap between the 1974 shooting and the later ones. Once again, Pacciani's name surfaced. He had been jailed between 1974 and 1981 for raping his daughters. During a search of Pacciani's house, the investigators found a reproduction of Botticelli's Primavera. Perugini thought that the painting's depiction of the nymph Chloris, holding roses in her mouth, was similar to how Carmela Denunzio had been found, naked except for her gold chain above her mouth. Also of particular interest was another painting, signed Pacciani Petro, and depicted a bizarre-looking centaur. An expert concluded that it was compatible with the personality of the so-called monster. The task force also found 5 knives and a round from a hunting rifle, but not the murder weapon. On April 29, 1992, the deadline of the search, they found a rustled Winchester Series H cartridge, the same kind of ammo the monster used. The cartridge was buried in Pacciani's garden. Because it hadn't been fired, it didn't have the marking the monster's gun left on his casings, though there was evidence that it had been loaded into a gun. After being pressured by their superiors, ballistic experts subtly implied that the round had been inserted into the monster's gun. The police received a piece of a .22 Beretta, the same model used in the killings, wrapped in a piece of rag torn from cloth in Pacciani's garage, and an anonymous letter stating that it had been found beneath a tree where Pacciani often went. In a recorded interview with journalist Spizzi, Officer Arturo Minoliti voiced his suspicions that the round was planted by Perugini and that the letter was similarly manufactured by the police. Pacciani was charged with being the monster on January 19, 1993. The trial, which was broadcast live on TV, began on April 14th. Pacciani maintained his innocence, though Pacciani's wife and daughters recounted many of the crimes he committed against them. They testified that Pacciani could not be the monster because he was always drunk at home. Later, the centaur painting found at Pacciani's house was revealed not to have been his work at all. The actual artist was Christian Olivares, a Chilean painter. Though there wasn't much evidence against Pacciani that wasn't circumstantial, he was found guilty of all monster murders apart from the first one, for which he wasn't charged. One decisive factor was the testimonies of Mario Vanni, a friend of Pacciani's, whose only concrete statement was that there were picnicking friends, and Lorenzo Nisi, who claimed that Pacciani had boasted about the shooting pheasants with a gun, even though Pacciani denied owning one. Nasi also implicated him in the French couple's murder, which he said happened on September 8, 1985. Per Italian criminal law, Pacciani's conviction was subjected to an automatic appeal. The newly assigned prosecutor refused to even prosecute Pacciani, further decrying that the lack of evidence and comparing the investigators to Inspector Clouseau. On the day of Pacciani's expected acquittal, February 13, 1996, the police produced 4 witnesses who were initially anonymous. They were, the first, Fernando Pucci, codenamed Alpha, was a developmentally disabled man who claimed to have seen Pacciani commit the French couple's murder on September 7, 1985. The second was Giancarlo Lotti, codenamed Beta, a vagrant and village idiot who claimed to have aided Pacciani in several monster murders. Lotti also claimed that they carried them out on behalf of the wealthy Florentine doctor whose name was only known to Pacciani and who wanted to offer female body parts to the devil in black masses. The third was an alcoholic prostitute named Gabriella Giribelli, codenamed Sigma, who claimed that Pacciani and his friends had been members of a satanic cult. The fourth was Giribelli's pimp, Norberto Galli, codenamed Delta. The judge excoriated the police for this last-minute maneuver and refused to let the purported new witnesses testify. Subsequently, Pacciani was cleared of all fault and released. A higher court, however, overturned the appeal and sent the case back to be retried. But Pacciani died of a heart attack induced by medication contraindicated for his heart condition the day before the scheduled new trial in 1998. A few months later, Vanni and Lotti were convicted of being Pacciani's accomplices, even though Lotti's accounts of the murders hadn't matched the evidence at all. The investigation was reopened in 2001 when the investigators reportedly had reason to suspect that an alleged sect of 10 to 12 wealthy, sophisticated Italians were behind the murders. Some years later, Spizzi independently investigated the case with American thriller author Douglas Preston, while the two co-wrote the book The Monster of Florence, A True Story. In 2004, they showed crime scene photos of the 1985 shooting, which Spizzi had gotten a hold of, to entomologist Francesco Introna. In the photos, which were taken on September 9th, the maggots crawling on Nadine Moriot's mutilated body can be seen clearly. Based on their development, Introna determined that the victims were killed no less than 36 hours before the pictures were taken. This, coupled with the ignored testimony made by Sabrina Carminati, proved that the victims were killed on September 7th, disproving investigators' beliefs that the shooting occurred on September 8th. This also proved that the witnesses at Pacciani's trial, who said that the murders occurred on September 8th, lied. This disproved the satanic sect theory and Pacciani's guilt. Pacciani was at a country fair on the actual date of the shooting. When the news was broadcast, there was virtually no reaction from anyone, and Vanni and Lotti's convictions were not overturned. A few months later, journalist Spizzi was arrested on accusations of sidetracking a criminal investigation. He and Preston were also implicated in the death of Francisco Narducci, a Perugia doctor alleged to have been part of the purported satanic sect. Spizzi was briefly imprisoned but released and cleared of all charges. Preston left Italy while the charges against him were on hold. In an interview, he claimed that the interrogator had done so and subtextually told him to leave the country and never come back. In 2008, prosecutor Giuliano Mignini and Michele Guittari, the police officer who took the case over after Minoliti was promoted, were indicted for abuse of powers vested to them, not only for having Spizzi and Preston illegally arrested, but for abusing an anti-terrorism law to have Spizzi's phone wiretapped. Both were acquitted on the grounds that it couldn't be proven that any crime had been committed. The true identity of the Monster of Florence still remains a mystery today.
Spizzi, who had spent his career steeped in and tormented by the Monster of Florence, was convinced otherwise, infuriated by the baseless conclusions the investigators had drawn. While the public case was closed, Spizzi and a small group of men from the Carbonari continued to research the case privately. In the year 2000, American author Douglas Preston moved his family to Italy in search of that classic Tuscan dream. When Preston discovered that the 1982 murder had taken place across the street from his new home, his interest piqued. Preston befriended Spizzi, and together the two began to more intensely investigate the case that had now been closed for 7 years. Spizzi officially ended his search for the monster, and he was forced to forget the clues that might have closed the case. If you've made it in this far, you may be wondering, but what about the killer? You wonder what the rest of the world, to this day, the Monster of Florence remains an open case. If you enjoyed our broadcast, we're on Venmo, PayPal, and Buy Me a Cup of Coffee. Hope you'll stay tuned for the next episode, which is coming soon. Until next time.